10 decisions that will change everything. Somewhere out there, right now, there's a decision waiting for you. And whether you make it or avoid it, your life will never be the same. Most people think their life changes through big events. It doesn't. It changes through 10 decisions made quietly, usually while nobody's watching. If you've ever felt like you're standing at a crossroads right now, don't scroll past this. Stay. Let's begin with something most people never stop to consider carefully: the difference between a preference and a decision that actually changes everything. Throughout an average day, you make hundreds of small choices: what to eat, what to wear, which route to take, how to respond to a minor inconvenience. These choices matter in the moment, but they don't redirect a life. They're preferences, not turning points. And the mistake most people make is treating every choice with the same weight, which means they never learn to recognize the rare moments when a decision is actually about to reroute everything that follows. A turning point decision doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It rarely arrives labeled as significant. Often it looks almost identical to dozens of ordinary decisions you've made before it. The choice to finally have a difficult conversation you've been avoiding looks, on the surface, just like any other conversation. The choice to walk away from a familiar but limiting situation looks, in the moment, just like any other exit. And yet, years later, when you trace back the actual origin of where your life shifted direction, it's rarely some obvious dramatic event. It's almost always one of these quiet decisions, made without music playing in the background, without any sense of occasion, simply a person choosing differently than they had 100 times before. This is exactly why so many people miss their own turning points entirely. They're waiting for the decision that will change everything to feel enormous, to feel unmistakably important, to arrive with some internal signal announcing its significance. But life rarely works that way. The decision to finally apply for the opportunity you'd been talking yourself out of for 2 years feels, in the moment, like just another Tuesday afternoon task. The decision to end a relationship that's been quietly limiting you feels, in the moment, like an ordinary, difficult conversation, indistinguishable from other difficult conversations you've had before. Nobody rings a bell to let you know that this particular decision is different from all the others. You only find out afterward, sometimes years afterward, that this was the exact moment everything started moving in a new direction. This is why learning to recognize these moments while they're actually happening is such a rare and valuable skill. Most people develop this awareness only in hindsight, looking back over a decade and identifying, after the fact, which decisions actually mattered. But by then, the decision has already been made, for better or worse, and the lesson can only be applied going forward, not retroactively. The people who seem to navigate life with unusual intentionality are often simply people who've trained themselves to pause at decisions that feel slightly heavier than the rest, even when they can't fully articulate why, and to give those particular decisions the weight and consideration they actually deserve, rather than rushing through them the same way they'd rush through choosing what to have for lunch. Here's what's worth understanding about the handful of decisions that genuinely redirect a life. They often share a common feeling, even if the circumstances around them look completely different. They tend to involve some version of discomfort, some sense of stepping away from what's familiar, some quiet resistance in the body that whispers, "This one is different, pay attention." That resistance isn't something to avoid. It's often the exact signal that you've encountered one of the rare decisions capable of changing your entire trajectory, rather than one of the countless ordinary preferences that will be forgotten by tomorrow. So the discipline worth building isn't about making every decision with maximum intensity. Most choices genuinely don't deserve that level of consideration. The discipline is learning to distinguish in real time between the decisions that are simply preferences and the rare ones that are actual turning points, and then giving those particular moments the full attention, courage, and consideration they require, instead of treating them exactly like every other unremarkable choice that fills up an ordinary day. Because somewhere in your life, right now, one of these turning point decisions may already be quietly waiting, disguised as something ordinary, for you to finally notice it for what it really is. Let's talk about a pattern that shows up in almost every meaningful decision a person ever makes. The decisions that actually change a life rarely feel safe while they're being made. In fact, if you examine the moments that ended up mattering most in your own story, you'll likely notice something uncomfortable but consistent. They came wrapped in fear, uncertainty, or a knot in your stomach that made you question whether you were making a terrible mistake. This isn't a coincidence. It's almost a rule. The decisions capable of genuinely changing your trajectory are, are, by their very nature, decisions that stretch you beyond what feels familiar. And anything that stretches you beyond the familiar will always trigger some version of fear before it delivers any version of growth. Think about why this happens. Comfort exists precisely where your current identity, current skills, and current circumstances already match what's required of you. When a decision feels completely comfortable, it usually means it doesn't require you to become anyone different than who you already are. It fits neatly within your existing capabilities, your existing risk tolerance, your existing understanding of what's possible for someone like you. But decisions that actually change everything require exactly the opposite. They require you to become someone slightly different than who you currently are. And that gap between your current identity and the identity the decision demands is precisely what registers internally as fear. This is why so many people mistake the presence of fear for a warning sign telling them to stop, when often it's actually a signal telling them they've finally found a decision large enough to matter. Small, insignificant decisions rarely generate fear because they don't ask anything meaningful of you. Choosing what to eat for dinner doesn't require courage because nothing about your identity or future is at stake in that choice. But choosing to leave a stable situation for an uncertain opportunity, choosing to have a conversation that might permanently alter a relationship, choosing to invest significant resources into something with no guaranteed return. These decisions generate fear precisely because something real is actually at stake. The size of the fear is often, in a strange way, a rough indicator of the size of the potential change. This creates an uncomfortable but important responsibility. You have to learn to distinguish between fear that's protecting you from genuine danger and fear that's simply protecting your current comfort from necessary growth. These two fears can feel remarkably similar in the body, but they come from entirely different places. The fear of walking into a genuinely dangerous physical situation exists to protect your safety. The fear of pursuing an opportunity that might not work out exists, most of the time, simply to protect your ego from the possibility of visible failure. One of these fears deserves your obedience. The other deserves your examination, and often your defiance. Here's what makes this especially difficult. In the moment you're facing one of these decisions, it rarely feels obvious which category the fear belongs to. It just feels like fear, undifferentiated and urgent, demanding retreat. This is why so many life-changing decisions get avoided entirely. The discomfort feels identical to danger, even when the actual risk is nothing more than temporary embarrassment or financial inconvenience, both of which are almost always survivable, and often even valuable in what they eventually teach you. So here's the practical shift worth making. Instead of asking, does this decision feel safe? Start asking, does this decision feel significant? And is the fear I'm feeling protecting me from real danger or protecting me from unfamiliar growth? Because if you wait for life-changing decisions to feel completely comfortable before you make them, you will wait indefinitely. And that comfortable feeling will simply never arrive. Not because the decision was wrong, but because meaningful growth was never designed to feel safe in the moment it's actually required. The scariest decisions are so often the exact ones that end up mattering most, precisely because the fear was never a stop sign. It was simply proof you'd finally found something worth being afraid of. Let's talk about a misunderstanding that keeps so many people waiting for a moment that will never come. The belief that a completely different life requires one giant, singular decision to unlock it. People imagine their transformation arriving through some enormous, dramatic choice. The day they quit everything and start over. The day they make the one bold move that changes their entire trajectory in an instant. And because they're waiting for that one massive decision to present itself, they often overlook the much quieter truth about how a life is actually rebuilt through small, aligned decisions, repeated so consistently over time that they eventually accumulate into an entirely different direction. Consider how this works in practice. Nobody becomes financially secure through one single decision made on one single day. It happens through the decision to spend slightly less than you earn, repeated across hundreds of ordinary purchasing choices. It happens through the decision to save a modest amount consistently, month after month, long before that amount feels significant enough to matter. Any one of these individual decisions, looked at in isolation, seems almost irrelevant. Skipping one unnecessary purchase doesn't change a financial future. But skipping unnecessary purchases as a consistent pattern, repeated across years, absolutely does. The individual decision is small. The compounded pattern is enormous. The same principle governs nearly every meaningful transformation. Nobody becomes healthy through one extraordinary workout or one perfect week of eating. Health is built through the decision to move your body consistently, repeated across hundreds of ordinary days, most of which feel completely unremarkable while they're happening. Nobody builds a successful career through one impressive presentation or one lucky break. Careers are built through the decision to show up prepared, repeated meeting after meeting, project after project, long before anyone in a position of authority is paying particularly close attention. This is precisely why so many people feel discouraged in the middle of their own transformation. They're measuring their progress against the fantasy of one dramatic decision that instantly changes everything. And when their actual experience looks like small, unremarkable choices that don't seem to be producing visible results yet, they conclude that this slower, quieter path must not be working. But this conclusion misunderstands how compounding actually functions. Small, aligned decisions don't produce visible results immediately, precisely because compounding requires time to build momentum. The early repetitions of any small decision look almost identical to doing nothing at all. It's only much later, once enough repetitions have accumulated, that the pattern becomes undeniable, visible, and impossible to attribute to luck or circumstance. This is also why destiny, in the way people usually imagine it, isn't something that simply happens to a person through fate or fortune. Destiny, in the most practical sense, is simply the compounded result of thousands of small decisions, most of which felt insignificant while they were being made. The person who ends up with a thriving career didn't stumble into it through one lucky moment. They arrived there through years of small decisions to keep learning, keep showing up, keep improving, repeated long after the excitement of any single decision had completely worn off. The person who ends up in a fulfilling relationship didn't get there through one romantic gesture. They got there through thousands of small decisions to communicate honestly, to show up consistently, to choose patience over frustration, repeated across countless ordinary days that nobody would think to write a story about. So if you're waiting for the one giant decision that will finally change everything, you may be waiting for something that was never actually going to arrive in the form you're expecting. The real work, the work that actually reshapes a life, is far less glamorous than that fantasy. It's the daily decision, repeated without applause, without immediate proof that it's working, chosen again and again simply because it aligns with the direction you've decided to move in. Individually, each of these decisions looks too small to matter, but compounded over enough time, they become the entire architecture of a destiny that, from a distance, looks like it must have been inevitable, when really, it was built. Decision by unremarkable decision, by someone who simply kept choosing the same direction long enough for it to become undeniable. Let's finish with the truth most people never fully confront. The belief that avoiding a decision somehow keeps your options open, that standing still is a neutral position while you wait for more clarity, more courage, more certainty. This belief feels reasonable on the surface. It feels responsible, even wise. But it's an illusion. And it's one of the most costly illusions a person can carry through life. Because indecision is never actually neutral. Refusing to decide is itself a decision. And it's usually the exact decision that quietly locks you into the default, the familiar, and the smaller version of the life you could have built. Think about what actually happens when you avoid making a choice. The situation doesn't pause and wait patiently for you to feel ready. Life continues moving forward, regardless of whether you've made a decision or not. And in that continued motion, something is still being decided, just not by you, deliberately. It's being decided by default, by whatever momentum was already in motion before you hesitated. The relationship you're unsure about doesn't remain frozen in some neutral holding pattern while you avoid the conversation. It either continues drifting in the same direction it was already heading, or it slowly erodes from lack of attention. The opportunity you're not sure you're ready for doesn't wait indefinitely for your certainty to arrive. It moves towards someone else who was willing to decide while you were still deliberating. This is the part that most people never fully internalize. Every day you postpone a decision, you're not preserving a blank, unwritten future. You're actively choosing to continue whatever is already happening right now. If your current situation is comfortable and aligned with what you actually want, that's a fine outcome. But if your current situation is exactly what you're trying to change, then refusing to decide isn't protecting you from the wrong choice. It's guaranteeing the wrong outcome by default, simply because you decline to actively choose choose anything different. This is why indecision so often masquerades as patience, as prudence, as simply waiting for the right time. But examine most instances of prolonged indecision honestly, and you'll usually find something less noble underneath the surface. Not careful strategic patience, but fear, dressed up in more acceptable language. Fear of making the wrong choice. Fear of the discomfort a real decision requires. Fear of being responsible for an outcome that might not work out. And so, rather than face that fear directly, a person simply avoids deciding at all, telling themselves they're being thoughtful, when really, they've just handed the decision over to time, circumstance, and default, none of which have any particular investment in your well-being. Here's what makes this especially important to understand. The default outcome, the one that happens when you refuse to decide, is rarely the outcome you would have consciously chosen for yourself. Default outcomes tend to favor whatever requires the least effort, whatever preserves the current comfort, whatever avoids friction in the short term, regardless of long-term cost. This is why so many people, years later, look back at a stretch of their life defined by indecision and realize that stretch quietly cost them more than any wrong decision ever could have. A wrong decision, at least, teaches you something, redirects you, gives you new information to work with. Indecision teaches you nothing. It simply consumes time while changing nothing. And time, unlike almost every other resource, never comes back once it's spent. So the discipline worth building here is simple to state, even though it's difficult to practice. Recognize that standing still is not actually standing still. It's moving, just in whatever direction was already set in motion before you arrived at the crossroads. If that direction is fine, indecision costs you little. But if that direction is exactly what you're trying to escape, then every day of avoided decision is quietly reinforcing the very outcome you claim you don't want. Decide, even imperfectly, even uncertainly, because an active decision, however flawed, at least belongs to you. A decision made by default belongs to nobody, and yet somehow, it's still the one that ends up shaping your entire life. If your entire value exists only within the boundaries of what's mandatory, then you are, by definition, exactly as replaceable as anyone else capable of meeting that same minimum standard. Irreplaceable is never built in the visible hours. It's built in the hours nobody assigned you, the hours nobody is checking, the hours where no one would even notice if you simply didn't show up. This is where the real separation happens, quietly, invisibly, long before anyone in a position of authority ever becomes aware of it. Think about what happens during the hour before everyone else arrives, or the hour after everyone else has gone home. In that unscheduled space, there's no supervisor watching, no deadline forcing your hand, no external accountability keeping you honest. What you choose to do in that space reveals something that the required hours never could. Whether you're someone who does only what's demanded, or whether you're someone who does what's needed, regardless of whether anyone assigned it or would even notice. This is exactly why two people can hold the identical job title, complete the identical tasks during business hours, and yet one of them becomes utterly indispensable, while the other remains easily interchangeable. The difference isn't visible on a job description, it's invisible, embedded in what each person chose to do when nobody required anything of them at all. One person clocked out mentally the moment their obligation ended. The other kept going, driven not by supervision, but by a personal standard that had nothing to do with what was being watched. Understand what's actually happening in those unseen hours. You're not just completing extra work. You're building capability, insight, and depth that nobody else in your position possesses, simply because nobody else was willing to invest time where no one was giving credit for it yet. The early morning spent learning something adjacent to your role. The evening spent refining a skill nobody asked you to refine. The extra effort poured into a project long after the minimum requirement was already satisfied. None of this shows up immediately. It doesn't show up on a performance review the following week. It doesn't show up in a raise the following month. It accumulates silently beneath the surface, compounding in a way that eventually becomes impossible to overlook. This is the part most people misunderstand about becoming irreplaceable. They expect the effort in the unseen hours to be immediately recognized. And when it isn't, they stop putting in that effort, concluding that it wasn't worth it. But recognition was never the point of those hours. Capability was the point. While others were doing exactly what was required and nothing more, you were quietly becoming someone who could do more than what was required. And that gap, invisible for a long time, eventually becomes the very reason you're the one who gets called when something difficult arises. The one who's trusted with more responsibility. The one whose name comes up first when opportunities are being considered. This is why irreplaceable people often seem, from the outside, to have simply gotten lucky, promoted faster, trusted sooner, chosen more often. But luck rarely has anything to do with it. What actually happened is that long before the opportunity arrived, they had already spent countless unseen hours building a version of themselves capable of meeting it, while others were only building a version of themselves capable of meeting the minimum. So ask yourself honestly, what are you doing with the hours nobody requires anything of you? Because that answer, more than any job title, more than any amount of visible effort, is what will eventually determine whether you're someone who can be swapped out without consequence or someone whose absence would leave a gap nobody else quite knows how to fill. Let's talk about something that gets constantly overlooked in a world obsessed with skill building. Skills, no matter how impressive they sound, are far more common and far more replaceable than most people want to believe. Give someone 6 months, the right resources, and enough motivation, and they can learn to code, learn to sell, learn to design, learn nearly any technical ability that once felt exclusive to a select few. Skill acquisition has never been faster or more accessible than it is right now. And that accessibility, while wonderful in many ways, has quietly made skill alone one of the least reliable paths to becoming irreplaceable. Here's the uncomfortable truth behind this. If a skill can be learned in months, it can also be replaced in months. Whatever technical ability makes you valuable today can be matched and eventually exceeded by someone newer, hungrier, and often willing to be paid less for the exact same output. This isn't meant to discourage skill building. Skill matters, but skill was never meant to be the foundation of irreplaceability. It was only ever meant to be the entry price of the room. Getting in the room requires skill. Staying in the room, becoming someone the room cannot function without, requires something else entirely. That something else is character, and character cannot be learned in 6 months. Character is not downloaded from a course or absorbed from a weekend seminar. Character is built slowly, tested repeatedly, and proven only through time. Anyone can claim to be trustworthy in a job interview. Very few people can actually demonstrate being trustworthy across 6 consecutive years of decisions, especially the small decisions nobody was watching closely enough to notice. Think about what it actually takes to be dependable, not for one impressive project, but for years, across countless ordinary days where nothing exciting is happening and no one is paying particularly close attention. It takes showing up the same way on your best day and your worst day. It takes following through on commitments, even when circumstances shifted and an excuse would have been easy to justify. It takes remaining consistent when nobody would have blamed you for cutting corners just once. This kind of consistency cannot be faked convincingly for very long, because character reveals itself precisely in the moments nobody is paying enough attention to catch a performance. This is exactly why character is so much rarer than skill, and exactly why it's so much harder to replace. A company can train someone new on a piece of software in a matter of weeks. No company can train someone to actually be honest when honesty is inconvenient. No manager can teach someone to genuinely care about the outcome of a project when cutting a corner would have gone completely unnoticed. These qualities either exist in a person after years of consistent practice, or they don't, and no crash course accelerates that timeline. This is also why so many highly skilled people remain surprisingly replaceable, while some far less flashy, far less technically impressive people become absolutely essential to the teams and families and communities around them. Skill impresses people in the short term. Character earns trust over the long term, and trust, once fully earned, is one of the hardest things in the world to substitute. You can hire someone with more talent. You cannot simply hire someone with more years of proven trustworthiness. Most people calculate, often without even realizing they're calculating, that the risk of stepping toward that problem outweighs the benefit. And so they quietly step around it instead, hoping someone else eventually deals with it, or hoping it simply resolves itself over time. But problems like this rarely resolve themselves. They tend to sit and accumulate, growing slightly more complicated with each person who chooses to avoid them. And this is exactly where opportunity hides in plain sight. While everyone else is busy avoiding avoiding the discomfort, the person willing to step directly toward that problem without being forced to, without being specifically assigned to it, simply because they noticed it needed solving, immediately separates themselves from everyone standing on the sidelines. This is not about being reckless or taking on problems that aren't yours to solve. This is about recognizing that the very discomfort everyone else is avoiding is precisely what makes stepping into it so valuable. If solving a particular problem were easy, comfortable, and risk-free, someone would have already solved it. The fact that it remains unsolved is usually proof that it requires exactly the kind of courage most people aren't willing to offer. And courage, unlike skill, cannot simply be trained into someone overnight. It has to be chosen. In the actual moment discomfort is present, not rehearsed safely from a distance. Consider what happens when someone finally does step toward that avoided problem. Suddenly, they're not just another employee, another team member, another interchangeable face performing routine tasks. They become the person who solved what everyone else was too afraid to touch. That distinction is remembered. It's remembered by leadership, remembered by colleagues, remembered by anyone who witnessed the situation unfold. And more importantly, it establishes a reputation that's incredibly difficult to replace, because it's not built on a skill someone else could simply be trained to replicate. It's built on a demonstrated willingness to face discomfort when the easier option was fully available and widely chosen by everyone else. This is why the person who solves the avoided problem often ends up trusted with far more responsibility than their technical skill alone would justify. Leadership isn't only looking for the most talented person in the room. They're looking for the person who can be trusted to handle what's difficult, uncomfortable, and uncertain. Because those situations arise constantly, and having someone reliable to face them is worth far more than having another person who only performs well when conditions are already comfortable and predictable. So here's the practical truth in all of this. Look around at whatever environment you're part of right now, whether it's your workplace, your family, your community, and ask yourself honestly, what is the problem everyone can see but nobody wants to touch? That problem, uncomfortable as it may be, is very likely one of the clearest opportunities available to you to become genuinely irreplaceable. Not because solving it will be easy, precisely because it won't be. The very discomfort that's keeping everyone else away is exactly what will make your willingness to step forward impossible to overlook, and impossible, eventually, to replace. Let's finish with an image that changes how you think about your own value. The difference between being a brick and being a bridge. A brick is useful. A brick holds weight, fills a gap, serves its function within a structure. But here's the truth about bricks. Any one of them can be removed and replaced with another brick of similar size and shape, and the wall barely notices the difference. Most people, without realizing it, spend their entire careers building themselves into bricks. Solid, functional, dependable bricks, but bricks nonetheless. Fully interchangeable with the next available brick waiting to take their place. A bridge is something else entirely. A bridge doesn't just occupy space within a single structure. A bridge connects two things that couldn't reach each other without it. Remove a brick from a wall, and the wall adjusts. Another brick slides into place, and the structure continues standing exactly as it did before. But remove a bridge, and something breaks that cannot simply be patched over with another interchangeable piece. The connection itself is lost, and whatever depended on that connection now has to find an entirely new way across, if one even exists. This is the exact distinction that separates replaceable people from irreplaceable ones. Bricks perform tasks. Bridges create connections that didn't exist before they showed up. Bricks complete what's assigned to them. Bridges link departments that don't naturally communicate, translate ideas between people who think in completely different languages, hold together relationships and processes that would otherwise fracture apart from lack of connection. And because bridges do something structurally different from bricks, they cannot simply be swapped out with the next available option, because the next available option doesn't have the same connections built into them. Think about what it actually means to become a bridge rather than a brick. It means you're not just excellent at your individual task. You understand how your task fits into the larger picture, and you use that understanding to connect people, ideas, and processes that would otherwise remain isolated from each other. It means when two departments are struggling to communicate, you're the person capable of translating between them, because you've taken the time to understand both sides well enough to bridge the gap. It means when there's tension between two people who see a situation completely differently, you're able to step into the middle and connect them, because you've built enough trust and understanding with both sides to hold that connection together. This kind of value cannot be replicated overnight by hiring someone new, because a new person, however skilled, doesn't yet have the relationships, the institutional knowledge, or the trust required to serve as that same connection point. A brick can be replaced instantly, because a brick's value exists entirely within itself. A bridge's value exists in what it connects, and connections take time, consistency, and relationship to build. This is precisely why removing a bridge creates a gap that lingers, long after a replacement brick would have already been slotted seamlessly into place. So here is the real question worth asking yourself. Are you simply completing your individual function within the larger structure, doing your job well, staying within your lane, being a solid and dependable brick? Or are you actively working to understand how the different pieces around you connect, positioning yourself as the person who links what would otherwise remain disconnected? Because bricklayers can always find another brick. But when a bridge is gone, everyone standing on either side of that gap feels the absence immediately, and no readily available replacement exists to instantly restore what was lost. Becoming irreplaceable was never only about doing your individual job exceptionally well. It's about becoming the connective tissue that holds a larger structure together. The person whose absence wouldn't just leave an empty seat, but would leave two sides suddenly unable to reach each other the way they once could. Choose, starting today, to build yourself into that kind of bridge. Because bricks, no matter how solid, are always replaceable. Bridges, when they're truly needed, almost never are. What you choose to do in that space reveals something that the required hours never could. Whether you're someone who does only what's demanded, or whether you're someone who does what's needed. Regardless of whether anyone assigned it, or would even notice. This is exactly why two people can hold the identical job title, complete the identical tasks during business hours, and yet one of them becomes utterly indispensable, while the other remains easily interchangeable. The difference isn't visible on a job description. It's invisible, embedded in what each person chose to do when nobody required anything of them at all. One person clocked out mentally the moment their obligation ended. The other kept going, driven not by supervision, but by a personal standard that had nothing to do with what was being watched. Understand what's actually happening in those unseen hours. You're not just completing extra work. You're building capability, insight, and depth that nobody else in your position possesses, simply because nobody else was willing to invest time where no one was giving credit for it yet. The early morning spent learning something adjacent to your role. The evening spent refining a skill nobody asked you to refine. The extra effort poured into a project long after the minimum requirement was already satisfied. None of this shows up immediately. It doesn't show up on a performance review the following week. It doesn't show up in a raise the following month. It accumulates silently beneath the surface, compounding in a way that eventually becomes impossible to overlook. This is the part most people misunderstand about becoming irreplaceable. They expect the effort in the unseen hours to be immediately recognized. And when it isn't, they stop putting in that effort, concluding that it wasn't worth it. But recognition was never the point of those hours. Capability was the point. While others were doing exactly what was required and nothing more, you were quietly becoming someone who could do more than what was required. And that gap, invisible for a long time, eventually becomes the very reason you're the one who gets called when something difficult arises. The one who's trusted with more responsibility. The one whose name comes up first when opportunities are being considered. This is why irreplaceable people often seem from the outside to have simply gotten lucky, promoted faster, trusted sooner, chosen more often. But luck rarely has anything to do with it. What actually happened is that long before the opportunity arrived, they had already spent countless unseen hours building a version of themselves capable of meeting it, while others were only building a version of themselves capable of meeting the minimum. So ask yourself honestly, what are you doing with the hours nobody requires anything of you? Because that answer, more than any job title, more than any amount of visible effort, is what will eventually determine whether you're someone who can be swapped out without consequence, or someone whose absence would leave a gap nobody else quite knows how to fill. Let's talk about something that gets constantly overlooked in a world obsessed with skill building. Skills, no matter how impressive they sound, are far more common and far more replaceable than most people want to believe. Give someone 6 months, the right resources, and enough motivation, and they can learn to code, learn to sell, learn to design, learn nearly any technical ability that once felt exclusive to a select few. Skill acquisition has never been faster or more accessible than it is right now. And that accessibility, while wonderful in many ways, has quietly made skill alone one of the least reliable paths to becoming irreplaceable. Here's the uncomfortable truth behind this. If a skill can be learned in months, it can also be replaced in months. Whatever technical ability makes you valuable today can be matched and eventually exceeded by someone newer, hungrier, and often willing to be paid less for the exact same output. This isn't meant to discourage skill building. Skill matters. But skill was never meant to be the foundation of irreplaceability. It was only ever meant to be the entry price of the room. Getting in the room requires skill. Staying in the room, becoming someone the room cannot function without, requires something else entirely. That something else is character, and character cannot be learned in 6 months. Character is not downloaded from a course or absorbed from a weekend seminar. Character is built slowly, tested repeatedly, and proven only through time. Anyone can claim to be trustworthy in a job interview. That has to be built slowly, the same painstaking way it was built in you. So if you're serious about becoming irreplaceable, don't stop at building skill. Skill alone is a race you will always eventually lose to someone faster, cheaper, or hungrier. Instead, commit to building the kind of character that takes years to fake convincingly. Be the person who is consistent when it's inconvenient, honest when a lie would have been easier, and dependable across circumstances nobody is tracking closely. Skills will always be common because they can be taught quickly. But a person who has quietly proven their character for years, that person becomes something no resume, no training program, and no faster replacement can ever fully substitute. There's a pattern that repeats itself in almost every workplace, every family, every organization you'll ever be part of. There is always at least one problem everyone can see, and yet almost nobody is willing to touch. It sits there, quietly, month after month, sometimes year after year, acknowledged in passing conversation, but never actually confronted. And here's what most people never realize. That avoided problem is one of the clearest paths to becoming completely irreplaceable, precisely because almost everyone else is choosing to walk past it. Think about why problems get avoided in the first place. Usually, it's not because people don't notice them. It's because solving them requires discomfort.